Good luck, Christie.
Thanks, you too. Break a leg. Mared.
We're just waiting for everybody to join us, so just give us a minute and we'll get started. Lots of people on time tonight. We love to see it.
Yeah, I'm impressed.
I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds maybe. Hello and welcome. My name is Emily Summer, and I'm the book buyer at East City Bookshop here in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Thank you so much for being here. One tiny silver lining of being confined to virtual events right now is that people can join us from all over. So no matter where you're located tonight, we're so glad to see you. We love to see it in the chat. Please feel free to introduce yourself if you haven't already and continue to comment throughout the event. We miss seeing your faces and your reactions, but the chat allows us a little bit of that interaction, so don't be shy. Our events coordinator, Chris Watson, is also monitoring the chat tonight for any technical difficulties. So if you have any issues, please let us know that in the chat as well. Next to the chat function at the bottom of your screen is the Q&A feature. We will have time tonight for audience questions, so please put them there. That's where we'll be sure to see them. And now the reason we're all here. Sean Desmond, author of Sophomores, is also the publisher of 12, an imprint of Grand Central, and has been in the publishing world for more than 25 years. His first novel, Adam's Fall, was published in the year 2000 and was adapted into the film Abandoned, starring Katie Holmes. In conversation with Sean this evening is Christie Tate, a Chicago-based writer and essayist. Christie's recent memoir, Group, How One Therapist and a Circle of Strangers Saved My Life, was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick and an instant New York Times bestseller. We're thrilled to have them both with us this evening. Welcome, Sean and Christie, and you can take it from here.
Thanks, Emily. Hey, Sean.
Hey, Christie, it's great to talk to you.
It's good to see you. Congratulations on your book. It's so beautiful. I know people all over Chicago are reading it, and they knew about it before I mentioned it. So you're making waves here in the Midwest. Why don't you start by telling everybody, the people who are listening who may not have finished yet, just give your elevator pitch for Sophomores. What is it, and what does it mean to you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Christie, for doing this. And thank you to East City for hosting us. Thank you to Putnam and Avid Reader, our book publishers. Thank you to everybody out there watching right now. And, you know, it's really funny because it was the summer of 1991. Christie was graduating from Ursuline Academy, Sean Desmond from Jesuit College Prep of Dallas. And we met at a graduation party at Kevin Sullivan's house. And we walked across the room and we both had our day planners out. And Christie was like, okay, so I'm thinking of publishing my memoir in October 2020. And I was like, oh, okay, because that's funny. I was going to wait until Joe Biden was president and publish my novel 3 months later, but we worked it out and it all worked out great. And it's so great all these years later to see you. And congratulations on the bestseller, Christie. I'm so proud of you. So happy for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Sophomores. Sophomores is the story of the Malone family. Pat, the father, who has brought his family down from their enclave in the Bronx in the 80s, worked for American Airlines. And he's having trouble at work, trouble with drinking, and he also suffers from MS, multiple sclerosis. Anne Malone, the mother figure, who is put on a famous Dallas murder trial and faces a test of faith. But really where I started with Sophomores is the character of Dan Malone. He's the sophomore at Jesuit College Prep of Dallas, and his talents lay under a bushel. He's trying to squeak by and not be awkward and teenagery, but there's a special teacher in his life, Mr. Oglesby, his English teacher, who finds him and seeks him out and inspires him to think, to write, and to be creative. And so that all happens over the the fall of 1987 into the calendar of the school year in 1988. And it's a portrait of middle-class Dallas. It's a portrait of a lot of things at the time. But let me throw it back at you, Christie. So tell me your elevator pitch for those who haven't had a chance to read Group, and everyone should. Tell us why you wrote the book and what it's about.
Sure. I have a one sentence elevator pitch, but it's full of curse words. So I can't do this just in case my mom ever logs on at any point and hears this. Essentially, I was a law student in Chicago. I was perfectionistic, rigid. Howard Stern said I was sexually uptight, which is fair, not based on personal experience, from the book. That'd be a different book. And I found out I was first in my law school, and I celebrated for about an elevator ride. And by the time I got back onto street level from the bursar's office, I was like, this is terrible. This is all I'm ever going to have. I'm going to have this job with these billable hours. And I sucked at having relationships and friendships. Romance, forget about it. They were disastrous. And I knew deep inside, I was really, really, really setting myself up for a life to be totally alone. I thought I'd have great purses because I was going to be a baller lawyer, but I would have no people, and I just couldn't bear it. And someone suggested her therapist, and I was like, I don't have any money. I'm a law student. And she said, oh, it's cheap. It's group. And I thought, okay, I'll do this group until I graduate and I'll get a real therapist. But I stayed, and it transformed my life, and the shenanigans that ensued are what comprise the book. And I think it generally has a happy ending. I think I'm supposed to say that because my husband can hear me. But what I discovered was people don't know much about group therapy, and that's why I just wanted to write the book, because I think it was a challenge. And then also I think at the end of the day, the more we know about mental health options, the better the world is, whether you ever want to do group or not.
Nicely said. Can I follow up with something?
Yeah.
I'm just really, let me start with this. So writing could be a form of therapy for you, Christie, right?
Sure.
It could be part of what you do. You talk about group therapy in the book, but also like what is amazing and why everyone should read your book is that there's just like sort of like a candor about what you get out of therapy, about what you get out of other people, and you're trying to figure out your own problems, yet not like stampede over everything else. So I was just wondering, like, if you could just talk a little bit about writing as therapy. When you wrote the book, did it feel better? Did it solve things for you? Did it open things up and that are unresolved? Or like, how is writing therapy for you? And is it part of your therapy?
I would say yes, that it is part of my therapy. I backed into it. What I what I discovered through writing these stories. Now, I told all these everyone in the book or all through group, I was talking about these stories, but turning them into a narrative, a written narrative. The number one thing it did, it's enhanced any work I've done in therapy, is it gave me such immense gratitude for the boys who dated the boys and the men who dated me. Like what gifts they gave me, even the ones that weren't suitable and we didn't have the right fit at all. Writing about them helped me have immense empathy for both of us, but both of us in every situation. So that sort of tenderizing sensation I have towards young Christie and all the people who helped me along my way. If some of those men had been any less disastrous, I might have stayed longer. So I'm grateful for all my experiences. Like there's a promise in the 12-step program that says we will not regret the past or wish to shut the door on it. And writing took that to the next level. And I could really appreciate that I couldn't have gotten well on my own, and I couldn't have gotten well just in group. I needed to have experiences out in the world that
Mhm.
would help me make sense and take the show on the road essentially. And I'm really glad you asked that question because I saw your conversation last week, when you the day of your book publication, and on this similar theme, I'm wondering, when you write about, and you've been forthcoming about some of the aspects of the book are of sophomores, are autobiographical or drawn from your life, and I'm wondering, what's the effect? You're a father, you had a father. What does it mean to write about a very flawed father? And what does that do in your relationship? I know your father has passed, but I still have a relationship with people I've passed. Like, what does it do to your relationship to yourself as a father and your father to write and to really dig in? Some of these scenes are so, when he's sick and Dan walks in on him and he's like, it's just the flu, it's just the flu.
Yeah.
That's so moving. So what's it like to write that, and how does it change you as a father?
Yeah, and, that's the tough one of the toughest things of all about writing about, but also like as many people I know in the audience, and when you live with someone with chronic illness, it's just really it's hard. They can be depressed, they can be up and down, it can change day to day, but there's always this sort of background radiation of tension
Mhm.
and upset. And so what I tried to characterize, and by the way, as I'll say many times, the book is heavy when it comes to alcoholism and some of Pat Malone, the character's sort of downfall and bottoming out. But there is a redemption quality to it. And what I think that, to babble a little bit and circle back around to your question, is that I too, like I'm immense. I drew immense appreciation for these characters the more I wrote about them. And I did start with sort of Dan Malone, the sophomore, the 15-year-old, and it moved towards Pat. The book just, Pat starts to take over. And what I think really happened was my empathy for Pat, my experiences as a recovering alcoholic myself, and started to conflate or compile into this character. And so he sort of took over and I sort of related. And then sure enough, you're right. I wake up and I'm like, wait a second. I'm like 45 now, 48 years old, and I'm in that position. And it comes full circle. And I have now complete respect for all the difficult choices and faults that my parents had. Hi, Mom, if you're watching. And I get it. I get it now as a father to soon to be a sophomore next year. It's tough, and so I really appreciate the question. It's hard to it's hard to write that other than to say it was written with love and empathy, but also like, yeah, there is a darkness to the illness and stuff like that that has to be explored, and the fact that these people are sophomores, and so what that means is they have blind spots. They're really smart, they're well educated, they know what they're doing, they're very good at their work, careers, and what have you, but they are conflicted. They hide stuff from themselves. They hide stuff from other people in their family. They don't want to show weakness. And so that's the wise fool of drinking, of of all sorts of things in the book.
Well, will you talk just a little bit about Anne, the mother character? What talk about her blind spot and how that came to you and why the Walker Rayleigh. What do you remember that from the 80s? I'm like, I should remember that. I remember Jessica in the Well, but I don't remember. I just don't think that hit the pages of 17 magazine, so I don't recall it.
So the character, let me talk about the character of Anne Malone is based on my mother, Anne Desmond, who a longtime public school teacher, then taught all over, was also the librarian at my old high school. And it's based on her in a lot of ways, that she grew up in the 20th century in sort of a strict Irish Catholic background from the South Bronx, and grew up super intelligent, great, like did well at every level: Cathedral High School, Fordham College, Hunter College for a master's, Fordham for her PhD. And she knew and always taught me to think independently and to question authority, whether that be the church, the educators, the mechanic who's fixing the Mercury Zephyr, like whoever it is, you have to question it all, right? And you have to be, and so I've always loved that about my mother and about that character. And so in the book, she faces this murder trial. She's put on the jury, and it's based on the case of Walker Rayleigh. And so Walker Rayleigh was this Methodist Park Cities minister in the 80s, famous case. His wife, who was a teacher at Christie School, Ursuline, was found strangled in the driveway, and despite a preponderance of evidence and looking guilty, was never found guilty of it. And this trial in the book takes months, but it actually took years in Dallas, and it was like a sort of a media sensation. But what it is really, and not to belabor the facts of that murder, that actual murder trial, what it is a test of faith. Like, how do you know? How does Anne Malone, someone who's so smart, how does one know what they believe in? And that's the question that religion poses for us, but also the question of the trial, which is, how do we believe when we don't have the evidence right in front of us, or we have some idea, we have some inkling, but we can't piece it together perfectly? What do you then believe in and stand for?
I thought that was super well done. And I mean, I love stories about sophomore age kids. I love that age. So I was predisposed to love Dan and all his friends and all of their antics. And I really did. Even I saw you say that the book is a tribute to the friendships that you had, which I happen to know because we grew up together. I know that you used actual names of your friends.
That's right.
And I was like halfway through, I was like, this is a love letter to friendship, to high school friendship. And what the scene that stays with me the most is the prank calling, which is so 80s. I don't know if they did that other places, but it called to mind being a victim of prank calls and making prank calls. And I just thought there was something so tender and so loving about that. And is that I assume, I just want to hear you talk about your friendships and these guys that came to life in your book who are real people.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I think right around then is where we all discovered Star 69. That changed the whole prank calling universe, right?
Game over, yeah.
Like, and so that kind of came back on us, and like, but and it is a tribute to like late 80s phone technology, and just that the phone was so much different, and that we were so bored, and that we couldn't go anywhere and do anything. So I kind of love that about it. But yeah, so I have these real sophomores in the book, my crew, and the real people who inspired these characters: Rob McGee, Steve O'Donnell, Rick Dowlern. These were the guys who saved me. Like, I had trouble with stuff that was going on in my house. I had trouble not being my tempestuous, like, little Irish self, the little sophomore that I was turning into. And these guys were the ones who like straightened me out, would always just pick me up off the curve of Crown Shore Drive. And I don't know what we did. We just drove around and drank coffee. We didn't do anything wrong. Like, we just like, we just went down to Deep Ellum, but it was too scary, so we'd head back home. I don't know. We were good kids, and they were good to me. I think that each of the characters represents something, like a little attribute of like where Dan Malone sees his weakness. So Rick Dallern is the sort of playboy character in the book, and Rob McGee is the spiritual optimist, and Steve O'Donnell is the bathtub cynic, and all together it makes for a crew. So I really love them as characters, but also as people. And speaking of characters, you have some characters in your group that you talk
Do
about.
I? Yes, I do. That's my crew. They saved me.
Could you talk a little bit? I have so many questions about writing process, but
Yeah.
I saw the piece that that was in the New York Times. I think it was in the book review section, where you talked about how you sort of gave them early like, could you talk about how you protected the people in your group, and also has that changed the dynamics of your home group? Like, are people now, I could imagine, being a little wary. Oh, is Christie gonna write another book? Like, and stuff like that. Like, could you talk about how you protected them and your process with that?
Sure. So when this whole project started, what happened was I'd written a novel that was horrible, just unreadable, and I was complaining about it in group. So this would have been like 7 or 8 years ago, and I said, "Well, this is the kind of stuff I would do in group, right?" I'd say, "Well, I don't know how to end my book, so I'm just going to have the young lonely lawyer just have sex with her therapist," and everyone's like, what? That's terrible. And Dr. Rosen, I didn't use anybody's real name. So Dr. Rosen said, bring that in and let's read that out loud, which was awful. So someone read it, I think Brad, and everyone was like dying because they're picturing me and Dr. Rosen in my horribly written sex scene. And it was so, I can still hear the shrieks and the moans. They're like, oh my God, stop, make her stop. And somebody tossed off this comment, why don't you just write the real story? And this was probably August of 2015. And I just like took a break because I'm like, fiction was not going anywhere good for me. And that comment that Max made, and he was a group member, just tell the real story of the lonely lawyer and her therapist. And there was never any sex. And so then I thought, well, I'll write this as a practice, and then I'll go back to, I'll learn what I need to learn about the craft, and then I'll go back to fiction. And so I told them about it, and then it started to become like the real book. And I want to say I first sent them drafts, like 30 pages in. I'm sending my whole group drafts, like, this is what I'm doing. Not really asking permission, but definitely open for communication. If somebody was like, I'm not comfortable, shut this down. Now, I didn't totally account for the fact that no one wants to read my rough draft 30 pages, of course, but I would talk about the project and it was open, and everybody knew I never used real names. Like in the very first transcript, I have already changed people's names.
Right.
And so they knew about it all along. And I really, I've had other writers who were just shocked that I gave them full editorial, they could veto anything. And that's part of the uniqueness, I suppose, of the project. And it grew out of group. And sure, we have a sort of guideline that there's no secrets in the group, but that doesn't mean I get to take other people's therapeutic nuggets out to the world. Like, that was never the deal. So it was a process. And when eventually the group mates read it, none of them asked for any changes. One guy said he wasn't in it enough, and I was like, well, sorry. You should have been more helpful. And then somebody else, he didn't want to read it, so his wife read it, and she did suggest some changes, some things that were too close to biographical truth, and I of course changed those. And that's what I needed to do for my own ethics, and I did one full edit right before I got an agent. So this is like 4 years into the project. It was 5 years door to door. It's like 4 years in, I thought, there are I know in my conscience and in my heart, there are things that I have put in this story that belong to other people, like my group mates, because whatever you think about my life, I have shared the circle with really interesting people who have done really interesting things with their bodies, with their minds, in their professions. And some of that I had snuck in. And when it started to feel like maybe this will be a book, I was like, I got to take it all out. I got to stand on my own story and not borrow. And I knew exactly where the places were, and I just took it out. It wasn't worth whatever. Like I could have asked and said, "Do you mind if I put in?" It just wasn't worth it. I have to stand on my own story, and I've got to write it well enough that I don't have to steal in that way. It just would have felt really unethical.
That's interesting because what I love about group is that it isn't just sort of war stories from the people like going around the room and hearing the worst thing that they ever did,
Yeah.
which is kind of like frowned upon as far as I understand group therapy culture. Like, just telling war stories, like there has to be
Yeah.
a resolution or like a reason we're telling that story in order to like build or grow
Yeah.
off of it.
Yes.
And like that's what you do. What's the best interaction, I think, in your book is the fact that you never get ahead of your group members. They're always maybe slightly ahead of you
Yeah.
in seeing the problem.
Yeah.
And Dr. Rosen is, of course, like kind of like Oglesby, kind of like this wizard
Yeah.
of the book,
Yeah.
like and sort of like and can connect the dots for you and make the realizations happen. So I thought you just did an amazing job of that, and that's really hard to do because you kind of want to tell the best stories out there.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there's some
Group
good ones, guys.
therapy, here's some stuff, man.
Yeah, yeah. Like, yeah, totally. I'm about to tell one, but I'm gonna just shut it down right now. But
You can
woo,
tell
I'm
one
gonna
if
get in
you want.
trouble. But you asked a question, has it changed the group? So I still
Yeah.
go. We do it on Zoom because we're in Chicago, we're all locked down, and we've been doing it on Zoom since March. And so I think it feels like a group project, right? Like they'll say, one one of my friends was like, "Oh my gosh, our book was picked by Reese," and I'm like, "Yeah." Like it genuinely feels like that. And then of course, like I got some really. What I love about having the group is I'm a first time author. I live in Chicago. I'm not from the publishing world. I don't know anything, right? So I didn't know. This is just an example that might be entertaining, but like I didn't know people were going to tag me like on and say things about all of the things they don't like about me or my book and Dr. Rosen and blah blah blah. And I like I don't know how to not absorb that and really take that to heart. And I get to take it to group and we get to like talk it over. It's a place to go. So the group is both subject and it's also an active living thing where I still go. And I think it's probably I keep thinking I'm going to go and the group is going to be like, shut up already about your
Yeah.
dumb book. Like, I am getting divorced. I want a boyfriend. Like, people have big lives. And so it's a great check on nobody gets to dominate. Like, that's just not, there's no wallflowers. Like, I don't get to just elbow in and be like, hey, but I get my slice and I still get fed by the group. And I keep thinking any day they're just going to like cut me off. And it hasn't happened. And that I feel the most grateful for because I feel like I would be like, okay, write a new book. Let's talk about something else.
Nice. Did you I guess I have a question for you about let me switch gears. Since we have some people I saw in the chat. I saw Jay Applewhite in the chat.
Yeah.
So I have a question that Jay probably wants me to ask you, which
For
is
sure. Shoot.
let's talk about St. Rita's Catholic School. Let's talk about Dallas in the 1980s.
Oh, yes, please.
Let's talk about Crystal's Pizza on Inwood Road. And, all of these childhood experiences that you share with some of the people who are with us tonight and stuff. How did all of this affect you? How did you end up, to quote from the book, a misfit based on all of this growing up in Dallas in the 80s stuff?
Sure. Well, one of the things I think, like when you said earlier that Peggy Rayleigh was a teacher at Ursuline, that's where I went to high school. That to me typifies why I ended up in group because swirling around me is this horrible thing that I didn't have like cerebral knowledge of, but I know I absorbed it. I was a super sensitive kid and there were two things I loved. I loved feelings and I loved ballet, right? And so and I didn't have the body for ballet. So there was already tension there. I had the sense in Dallas that more money made you more better. I knew people like having a Mercedes was like, oh, that's like a big, it was just very materialistic. It was very materialistic. And maybe because we were on the cusp of a different, I don't know exactly why. It's just like North Dallas, there was that infusion of money. And I had the impression that like more be skinnier, be blonder, be really smart, but be really athletic, but don't act too smart in front of the boys. And there were so many like the lane just was very, it felt very, very narrow. And I didn't like football. And so you're out in Texas. You're just out. And I didn't want to do cheerleading. Now, I didn't want to do it because I wasn't built for it, or I didn't think I'd make it. And I went the theater route. And in Dallas, I think, or in that time and in that milieu, it's sort of like there was not a great celebration of peripheral like things. It was like there was such a great celebration for like the homecoming court, and maybe it's like that everywhere, but it just felt kind of turbocharged. Like the theater crowd was pretty small, and it didn't have the cachet that I imagine it would have had. I wanted to watch Fame, and I wanted to go to an arts high school, and that just wasn't on the offing, and it felt there was a confinement, and I don't know. I can say more about that, but say what it felt like to be a young man, because I don't know if that's a gendered experience.
It's funny, like there's like a scene in the book that where we all like sort of float down to Deep Ellum and drink a bunch of coffee and stuff like that. And I think we were on the cusp, Christie, of like real alternative culture, or like our little bubble in North Dallas, like penetrating that and going somewhere else in Dallas, like that wasn't part of that monoculture that you just described, which is, sort of football and cheerleading and like the classic tropes of sort of like high school life. And also there's a scene in my book where W.T. White High School plays Jesuit in football. And it really is, to quote my great history teacher, Mr. Donahue, the narcissism of small differences, right? Like it's two versions of North Dallas going at each other, but it was Hatfields and McCoys, right?
Yes, yeah.
Like for some reason, and there's just something very tribal about that and weird. And Dallas sort of, you're right, with the conspicuous consumption and a lot of the traits of Dallas in the 80s was very 80s. Like it wasn't like a leap when you watch a John Hughes movie or Heathers or something like that. It wasn't like, oh, I don't understand who these characters and cliques are. We had them, So I totally agree that it was hard to find those alternative voices or find yourself and not be, and because the alternative kids also were so alternative that you were naturally a poser, right? If you cared,
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so it's like always hard, like there's always a harsh side to all of that, but like
Yes.
that's school. That's high school, unfortunately.
A lot of it, and one of the things I love in your book, you touch on the Malones have come from New York, and there's something so specific about outsiders. And I remember I didn't know anybody. I mean, my parents would talk about like people were from north of the Mason-Dixon line. Like that's strange, and the idea that if somebody wasn't Catholic, and oh my God, from the East Coast, that's trouble. That's exotic. It's almost like an anti-intellectual bent, but it's something different. It's more like it's almost like the mafia. Everything you have, everything you need is in Texas. You don't need to go to Princeton or do anything outside of here. Everything you have is here. And when I think about when I first left Texas, I went first to Chicago. And I remember the first night we're in graduate school, everyone's from all different places, and they talked really funny, and they thought I talked funny. And everyone was like, well, should we get Thai food or should we get Ethiopian food? I was like, Thai food? Like the most exotic thing I'd ever had in Dallas was like baby back ribs at Chili's, like there just wasn't, it was real. There's just not a lot of diversity at the time. Did you have that experience when you left? did you realize, I mean, you left sooner than I did because you left for college, but was it shocking to go somewhere and it's like, guess what? You can eat a falafel instead of ribs.
Like, and also an Irish Catholic family, it was very meat and potatoes. So like, like chicken fried rice was like, what is this?
Yeah,
Like, what is this exotic meal?
totally.
But even that's part of just like also growing up and moving out and seeing new things and what have you. Um, but but yeah, I do think that that in some ways we were in this beautiful bubble of North Dallas with our high schools, and there was a safety to it, but there
Yeah.
was always like a sort of like an underside that I'd like to explore in the book, and just to Dallas in general, right? Like there's just like
Yeah.
Dallas has its own like sort of hidden history and mysteries, and so that's something that we grew up with and we can talk about. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, and um, one thing I was going to ask you about was I'm just like amazed. So I've worked in book publishing for 25 years and sort of figured out how to write, how to edit, who to know. And I have some beautiful friends who helped me with this, publish this book.
Mm.
You did this from the outside, which is unbelievable. Like, because talk about a provincial like bubble. Book publishing is, most of it happens on an island off the coast of America, and no one understands how anything gets published or whatever. What advice do you have for everyone on this call who's like, I've got this book in me. I have
Yeah.
the story. I got to start writing. I got to do it like Christie did it. Like, how do you start as sort of like you've become a pro, you're a best-selling writer, but how do you start as an amateur and get there?
Oh yeah. I mean, all I knew to do was I just had to write it. I had to get it out. And what I would say in terms of advice is build a writing network. And I did that by taking online classes. I found writers that I like. It turns out a lot of writers like do writing seminars and do workshops, and I would take them and I would make friends with people, and then it would snowball. Everything that has happened to me good with this book and with writing, actually my whole life, but and all the good things came because I reached out in my network. They came to me through the network. Like someone I know said, when you get ready to find an agent, query this person. And I wrote it down and I remembered it. And when I was ready, I reached out to her, and because you need an agent to move forward to major publishing. And I don't know. There's a million excuses not to do it. I don't have time. Who am I to write this? I don't know anybody. I don't live on the East Coast. Fuck all that. I'm sorry. That's my F bomb for the night. I get one. That's my one. You just got to do it. And I'm proof of it. And if you want to follow up, send me an email. We'll talk.
Nice. Look, one more question, and then we should get to some questions from our group and stuff like that.
Sure.
There's nothing quite like your book, Christie. It's so raw, it goes there, and like it's really fearless and it's really honest about the struggles you had.
Yeah.
Did you read a book and figure out how to do this? Like, is there a model that you had in mind? I can't think of the book that this is most like. There's baby boomer books like Fear of Flying by Erica Jane, and like there's books from a previous generation, but was there somebody who you're like, you know what, I got this, I know how to do it? Or did this just sort of come out of you in like a sort of the writing and journaling and the process?
No, I would say that I think it's like there were two books that were like my North Stars, and my dream, and I was saying I accomplished it, but the dream was to mash them together. And if they had a baby, it would be Groot. And the two writers that I revered was Samantha Irby, because she's a writer who goes there, and she's an essayist, but she's got a completely distinctive voice, and she's funny. And I'm not interested. I could never stick with a book length project that wasn't funny. I just can't do it. And the other person was the writer Lydia Yuknovich, who's she's not funny, but she's doing lots of other different interesting things. And in her nonfiction is experimental. And I don't think I didn't come out experimental in the wash, but there was something about, I think I always knew one of my strengths was voice. And so I had a lot of that. And I took some classes with Lydia Yuknovich, and she was sort of like, that's cool, but you tell a lot of jokes. How about we put
Mhm.
some other things in there? And so I was taught, and because I had these models, I think I revered the scene. And I'm a like I like to read scene. I want to My book didn't come alive until I had one line in there. Oh, sometimes I eat apples, blamp, and I went on to something else. And Lydia was like, whoa, 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 show us binging on apples. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, and that just sort of unlocked the key. All right, wait, we'll take audience questions, but let me just ask you one quick question about your
Okay.
process. You must have done so much research for this. Can you just say, because I didn't do any research for my book and I don't know what that looks like, the airline industry, what was going on, the Rayleigh trial, like you have a lot of meat in there. How did you do that? And is it was like one day a research day and then one day is a writing day, or do you have a bunch of index cards, or just can you tell us how you did that?
Well, so this book, Sophomore, started again, about 9 years ago, I quit drinking. And after about a year of that, I just said, okay, so what happened? What, and I was down, I was in the grays about it. And I was like, as a writing exercise, you always wanted to be a writer, Sean, write about the best summer of your life. And so uh, I wrote this thing about being a junior lifeguard at Glen Cove Swim Club. And in 90 days, I had like 90,000 words. It just sort of fell out of me. And out of that popped the Malones. And what I've discovered writing that thing about Glen Cove was that I loved going back to that book was set in 1986. So I went back to the summer of 86 and I saw who was on the mound for the Texas Rangers. What was the temperature that day? Like all of this, like just trying to like put little grace notes on like of reality into it. And then on Sophomores, I did that on steroids. So yeah, I totally researched the airline industry my father worked in. There's a book, in case anyone's interested, called Hard Landing,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is by Thomas Petzinger, which is all about the airline wars of the 70s and 80s after deregulation. And then also, to be honest, we talked about the Walker Rayleigh trial. I didn't want to do a disservice to Peggy Rayleigh, who and I just wanted to get things right. And
Yeah.
so in order to like put the book in like a real time and place, I just felt like I had to have these reality poles or along the slope, so to speak. And so that's kind of what I did. And it was kind of fun because like that's our childhood, Christie. It was a fun time. There was a lot of like, just like now, a lot of crazy crap going on at the same time, a lot of beautiful stuff happening, and you discover it both at the same time as a
Yeah.
teenager, as a sophomore. And that's what I loved about it. So,
Yeah, I don't mean to come across as a North Dallas 1980 hater. I just think it's important to criticize things. All right, let's take a question. This is from Jean Becker for Sean. Why do a fictionalized version of your life? Why not write an autobiography?
great question, Jean. And everyone look forward to Jean's book coming up in June of 2021 from 12 Books, a little book called The Man I Knew. And Jean, thank you for being here, and thanks for the question. I always wanted to write a novel. I really did. And as I just described, and I wrote this sort of piece about trying to quit drinking and like having the best summer ever. And I ended up with this family, the Malones, and they were just these great characters. What I wanted, rather than do a memoir from my perspective, what did I see and how did it affect me? I wanted these characters who I love and admire, especially Pat Malone, the father, to sort of live out, to walk in their shoes, for folks to like see it from their perspective, to understand them better. So it is, as Christie said really well earlier, and I'm babbling, it's an exercise in empathy. And that's why I did it as a novel.
All right. Let's get another one. Lori Gilman. As a native Texan, I was struck by your observation that so many people there really believe everything you'd ever need are in the state and there's really no need to go elsewhere. My parents were 100% certain of that and never understood why I wanted to leave. Why do you think that outlook is so dominant in Texas? And can you talk a little more about that? That's an awesome question. Um, I feel like that's part of the bravado of Texas. Like we're our own country. We have everything here. We've got beef. We've got football. We've got we've got I won't make this political, but anyway, I think that's part of I think it's what's awesome about Texas, and I think what can ensnare people if you need something that's outside the borders, like either the imagination borders or the actual literal borders. So, there's a sense that um, going somewhere else is a betrayal. It's almost like thinking like a family. Like you betrayed us by marrying outside of the family, like crossing the border. And I always feel like I almost feel like Louisiana, like you can go to Louisiana, like maybe for college if you couldn't get into Texas, or Oklahoma, maybe, but there's a whole Texas Oklahoma thing we can't get into. But you got to come back. You have to come back. There's sort of this sense that it's something about betrayal. It just reminds me of the mafia, which sounds
You know,
violent and wrong, but what do you think?
it is, I mean, it is God's country. Texas is a great place, but like New York, where I've lived all, like there are like these provincial pockets to it. And there's these things that like, where people have like a staying sense of it. Like in one scene in the book, Christie, like as the Malones are settling into life in Dallas, Pat Malone's brother-in-law comes to visit, and he's an FBI agent. And so they all grew up in the Bronx together. And this FBI agent says to Dan Malone, like, so where do you want to go to school? And of course he's like, Notre Dame. He's like, great. And he's like, or Princeton. And he's like, what are you talking about? So like the provincial thing, like, I guess to get ourselves out of here and sell some copies, let's just say that New York and Texas are a great place full of beautiful people and that they know what's up, and that's why there's so many books set there, because
Yeah.
they know what's up and you can't tell them what to do. That's the other thing. So there's lots of that.
Well, I do think it's interesting. You have lived in New York all these years, and your book, this Cry of the Heart, is set in Texas. And there's something really, really compelling. Like I have found myself writing a ton about Texas, and I can't explain it. It feels it's not something I have to grapple with it. I'm having to grapple with it in the
You,
best way, the richest way possible.
you're a sentimental Irish woman, and you can't help yourself. And now you understand. Like when I left Texas, I had to be more Texan than the Texans, right?
Yes.
And when I was in Texas, I had to be the New Yorker, and stuff like that. So like it's a weird. So you're probably thinking I'm just a big phony, but it's like a weird sort of like sentimentality and nostalgia for the place you missed. And that's true of the Irish immigrant experience of my grandmother's generation, but also celebrated by the Pat and Ann Malone, like as well. Like they listen to Irish music. They,
Yeah.
State Parade, like more Irish than the Irish was a really big thing for the Irish American experience. And I think it translates also to being a Texan.
I do too. I think that's brilliant. I'm going to queue up another question, but I've been meaning to ask you this. I saw in that Netflix series, Pretend It's a City, Fran Lebowitz talks about writers, and she said she's talking about there's so few writers who love writing, and she cites none other than Toni Morrison. And I thought of you when I heard her say that, and I was like, I bet Sean Desmond loves writing. I maybe there's a distinction to be made between writing with love and writing love letters and loving writing. But I'm just wondering, do you think of yourself as a person who loves writing? I mean, you have a day job. You don't have to do this.
I love helping people tell their stories. I will say that if I was left alone to write 24 hours a day, that 20 minutes of writing would happen and 23 and a half hours of laundry and procrastinating would happen, which probably my family wouldn't think is so bad. Like I like would clean up the house and stuff like that. But like for me, like writing is a little bit torturous. My process is a little inefficient. So I do love when it comes together. I mean, there's nothing better. Like when
Yeah.
it comes together and you hit it and and you feel good, it's great because it's a lonely, as you know, it's a lonely ride and you go up
Yeah.
and down. And one day it looks like crap and the next day it's reading well and you really don't know. You really don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't hate writing. I love helping people tell stories.
I love that. We're going to do a few more questions from the chat, but you guys don't be shy. You can order from East City Books. I've ordered from dozens and dozens of bookstores. Theirs come lickety split. So you can order sophomores, you can order group. They have a ton of great books that you can get. Okay, here's a question from Rosemary Marbach. Christie and Sean, how do you take care of yourself? Not only for being completely open and vulnerable, raw, having the public read your story, and then retelling and reliving these parts of your life at these book events over and over again to not burn out? Ooh, I've never had that question. You go first.
Great question, Rosemary. I guess we'll find out in 6 to 12 months
Yeah.
how this goes. But like Christy, I do a lot of group therapy. And I like to help other people with their problems. So I do my group therapy is twice a week, and it's with people with substance abuse problems, specifically drugs and alcohol. And I think what it creates and why it create when you've done it as many years as Christy and I have, it creates an openness, and it's okay to be vulnerable because you know other people share this problem, and so it creates that little community of strength for you. And Christy, you're the group expert. Let me see to you on more of that.
I would say one of the things that's helped, the reliving and telling these stories, like what has helped me is like having good boundaries. Like right when my book first came out, I said yes to everything, which is terrible boundary making. And like one day I had 3 events back to back, and it was like 6 hours of Zoom, like all me, all whatever, had a bra on, had lipstick on for 6 hours straight, which is like a record in the pandemic. And it was like, I had to learn the hard way, like just a little bit every day. Like I don't have to, I can still say yes to lots of things, but 3 in a row is just downright abusive. That's like, I didn't even know my name at the end. And so and I feel really lucky. Maybe you do too, Sean. It's like I'm really extroverted. Lots of writers are like, I hate this part. I don't want to talk to anybody. Like I really miss people. I love these conversations. And so I'm really lucky that I'm not a person who's shy or like finds this onerous. I find this like really vivifying. And I feel like that's a saving grace. Let's see. Sally Kim wants to know, since both of your books are based either entirely or closely on things that actually happen, how did you decide what to leave out?
That's a great question, Sally. I'm going to throw that to Chrissy because that was one of the questions I didn't get to. What was on the cutting room floor, or how, when you got to Lauren, your editor, and
Yeah.
Sally is my publisher, by the way. Thank you, Sally. And so, how did you, in the shaping of it into a story from sort of more raw group stuff, like what fell out and like.
Yeah, I would say by the time I got it to the publishing stage, I mean, because I was a nobody from nowhere, I knew it had to be like pretty ready to go. Now, we did a ton of editing, but most of what we did was shaving, and so nothing super significant. I'd already taken out so many things and done so many cuts. I think I underwrote it at the beginning. And so there were things like there's one relationship with one of the guys, and I just didn't have enough in there, and I'd taken him out and I'd put him in and I'd taken him out. But I needed him to be there. This is the character of Alex. And so I had just tried to shrink them down really small because I was embarrassed to have to tell another boy story in my memoir. And Lauren was like, I don't understand this at all. You need to like, give me some more here. So I was very surprised because when the first time I talked to her, I was like, this is way too long. We got to cut this down to about 60,000 words. She's like, maybe, like, you don't know. Like, she didn't share that. I just assumed it should be really, really small since I'm not famous. But it ended up being sort of different than I suspected. So what about you? I heard you say there's a story about William Kelly that's on the cutting room floor that I want to be a short story now.
I know I have to figure out this a way for, so the best story not in the book is the night where a character based on BJ Kelly, who Christie and I went to St. Rita's with, and Dan Malone go to the Dallas Sportatorium where they watch the Freebirds wrestle the Von Erichs, which, like, as anyone on the call from Dallas would know, is like a huge sort of Greek tragedy of a family, but also like this was like big entertainment in Dallas, was the Freebirds and the Von Erich, and it was at a high point in the 80s with fake wrestling. And it's as I've said before, it's sort of a little scene through the underworld, right? Like you go into this like weird kayfabe place where half the people, the Sportatorium was this dump, and filled with all of these people. Like half of them really thought it was real. The other half are screaming at the rafters, and like the whole thing's just like a mania. It's basically mania. It's close to like a church tent revival. Like it's just like, it's like the weird sort of force of an event like that. It almost makes you believe, you get caught up in it and stuff like that. So that was a fun one. I had really great editors. Gabriella Mongelli, who I think is on the call, was a wonderful editor who helps me pull back, because I did sort of kitchen sink a lot of things about Jesuit and Dallas. There's a strange scene where Anne Desmond runs into sort of the ghost of White Rock Lake. And so that's like that doesn't need to be in the director's cut, but like there's a lot of good stuff that she was really helpful with pulling it back and focusing. What's great about it is that, and I'm an editor, so I was like, of course, unbearable to cut with. Like I was like, what are you talking about? I know what I'm doing. Like, but it makes it so much better and so much stronger, and it focuses the attention on the Malones, the teachers, and the friends.
Yeah, let's see if we can grab one more. Oh, this is a cute one. Karen McCarthy, what was your mom's reaction to the book?
Oh, hey, well, my mom is very proud of me for writing a book. She was my first teacher. She's an English teacher. She made me read all the time and made me read really good books. And I should have it on the shelf back here and stuff, but she had that book selected by Helen Ferris, Poems Old and New, which was this great collection. And she would make me read poems in there, like Annabelle Lee, like poems like, I don't know if they even teach anymore, but like Charge of the Light Brigade. And like, to her, what was great about Anne Desmond, I'm not talking about the character, Anne Desmond, was the love of how important these poems and these words were. Like these things meant something. And so she gave me that. And she gave me this understanding that art is the most important thing. That's why it's on the top of the pyramid in terms of our whatever. It's where it moves you. It's the best expression of ideas and of all our problems. And that was a long, so did you see how I went a long way around not answering Catherine's question? So obviously I'm not sure like if she's entirely okay with the book, but I think she's okay. I think it's all right. But that was like a nice little Freudian dodge by me there. So.
Yeah, that was like a master class. It's 6:59. Let me see if there's one.
Let's get one for you, Christie. Somebody good, like.
But let's see. Well, we have an anonymous attendee. We can guess who that is. As Catholics, how did your own personal spirituality impact your book? Can we do this 30 seconds each?
Yeah, you go.
I would say for sure. I mean, confession is a big part of Catholicism, and I think that's memoir falls into that tradition. I see myself up there with St. Augustine and all the other memoirists in between. And I think that the notion of unburdening oneself is central to, that's the Catholicism I took and ran with. What
That's
about you?
a really good answer. Were you an altar girl at St. Rita's?
No, I wasn't.
So I was an altar boy at St. Rita's. And one of the great things, again, going back to Anne Desmond and Anne Malone, the character, question your institutions. You will not seen behind the curtain as an altar boy and dealing with these, excuse me, these fussy priests at 7 in the morning. Like, it sort of demystifies the whole process. And it makes for a greater spirituality and what have you. But like, something about writing this book and what I explore in both my editing and my career is trying to see behind that curtain, right? And see the other side, where it's not just some kid lighting the candles, but you know what's really going on behind the scenes. So that's
That
how.
makes me want to be an altar boy. Get more material. I think it's 7 o'clock, so I don't want to keep people. I know everyone's got snow to shovel and things to do, so I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Sean and Christie, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you to all of you who are watching from home. If you have not read Group or Sophomores yet, please do. It's such a gift to have these beautiful books anytime, but especially in 2020 and 2021. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you everybody for being here. Hope to see you in person at the store at some point in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Christy, for doing this with me. I'm sorry we can't all be together, folks, but we can read together and share the love. And Christy, what you've done for folks who are having struggles and trouble, if they can read this book, it's going to change people's lives. I really believe that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I love seeing everybody in the chat. It was like you all had a high school reunion. It was delightful. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.